It had always been a peaceful neighborhood, quiet streets, well-kept yards, and a familiar rhythm that never seemed to change. I'd come to appreciate that quiet, especially during my daily routine of watering the plants in the yard each evening. It was a small ritual, a time to unwind, surrounded by the soft rustle of leaves and the gentle hum of insects in the warm air. So when a moving truck pulled up next door, I felt a mix of curiosity and mild annoyance at the disruption to the usual calm. The new neighbor moved in quickly, carrying boxes inside with a quiet efficiency that matched the neighborhood's subdued atmosphere. He was a tall, unassuming man with sharp features and a reserved expression. We exchanged a brief nod as he caught my eye over the fence. His greeting was polite but clipped, his gaze drifting away almost immediately, as though he preferred not to linger on social pleasantries. I thought little of it at the time. Just another face, another addition to the neighborhood. But as I turned to finish watering the plants that evening, I couldn't shake an odd sense of unease, a feeling that was hard to explain. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just the strangeness of seeing a new face after so long. Yet as I walked back inside, I couldn't help but feel that something had shifted, a quiet disruption in the peace I'd taken for granted. The first few days after he moved in were quiet enough. I'd see him from time to time, usually heading out in the early mornings and returning late at night. He kept to himself, never lingering outside or chatting with neighbors. I barely noticed him, to be honest, until I started hearing faint sounds whenever I went to the yard to water the plants. At first, they were barely audible, a low hum, a murmur that could have been anything, maybe a television left on or a radio. But as the days went by, the sounds became more distinct, strange in a way I couldn't quite place. There were soft thuds, sometimes accompanied by what sounded like muffled voices, too low to make out. They came and went unpredictably, a dissonant note in the quiet of the evening, and each time I heard them, a cold feeling settled over me. I told myself it was nothing, that he was simply adjusting to his new home. Yet, there was something unsettling about those sounds, an unnatural quality that left me uneasy. I found myself lingering in the yard, straining to catch more details, trying to make sense of the noises that seemed so out of place in our quiet neighborhood. But each time, the sounds faded into silence before I could fully understand them, leaving only the faintest echo of unease behind. A week passed, and the noises showed no sign of stopping. If anything, they seemed to grow louder, filling the air with an oppressive tension that was impossible to ignore. Each evening as I watered the plants, the sounds seemed to creep through the walls of his house, a soft, rhythmic thumping, a low murmur that I could almost but not quite make out. I felt drawn to it, compelled by a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity to find out what was going on. One afternoon, I lingered a little longer than usual, my watering can in hand as I listened closely. The noises were there, unmistakable, and this time they carried a note of distress, like someone struggling to keep quiet. A chill ran through me as I realized these weren't just ordinary sounds. They were desperate, fearful. I started watching him more closely. I'd see him leave at odd hours, always with a hurried step, his gaze never meeting mine. There was something about his manner that felt guarded, as if he were hiding something, as if every move was calculated to avoid attention. The strange behavior, the muffled noises, it all added up to an unsettling picture, one I couldn't ignore any longer. The rational part of me insisted it was just my imagination, but the fear had taken root, a quiet voice in the back of my mind whispering that something was very wrong. One evening, as dusk settled over the neighborhood, I couldn't resist any longer. Driven by the need to know, I found myself creeping toward the side of his house, heart pounding, hoping to find some sign of what was going on. I felt ridiculous, sneaking around like a trespasser, but the sounds had become too much, too persistent to ignore. I crouched low, peering through a slightly open window, my pulse quickening as I strained to see inside. What I saw made my blood run cold. There, in the dim glow of a lamp, was a woman tied to a chair, her wrists bound tightly, her head hanging low. Her face was pale, her expression one of quiet terror, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for a way out. She looked exhausted, her body slumped as though she'd been there for days. A surge of panic washed over me, a sick realization settling in. I wasn't imagining things. The sounds, the late-night comings and goings, they all pointed to a horrifying truth. I knew I had to act. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what to do, fear and urgency battling within me. I couldn't just walk away, not after what I'd seen. I knew I was taking a risk, stepping into a danger I didn't fully understand, but I had to try. I had to save her. A surge of adrenaline carried me forward, driving out the fear. I moved quickly, slipping through the door that had been left ajar, and found myself inside the dimly lit hallway. Every sound seemed amplified, my heartbeat pounding in my ears, the creak of the floor beneath my feet. The house had a stale, oppressive atmosphere, as if the walls themselves held secrets, absorbing every dark deed that had taken place within them. I found her in the same room I'd seen from outside, slumped in the chair, her eyes widening as she noticed me. I moved to her side, whispering that I was here to help, that everything would be okay. Her wrists were bound tightly, the rope biting into her skin, leaving angry red marks. I fumbled with the knots, my fingers clumsy with urgency as I tried to free her. She managed a weak smile, a flicker of hope in her exhausted gaze, but her relief was short-lived. Footsteps echoed from down the hall, the unmistakable sound of someone approaching. My stomach dropped as I realized time had run out. I whispered for her to stay silent, then backed away, searching for a place to hide. With no other choice, I slipped behind a door, pressing myself against the wall and praying he wouldn't notice the woman's loosened restraints. I held my breath as he entered, his footsteps slow and deliberate, as though he knew something was amiss. He moved toward the woman, his gaze narrowing as he noticed the loose ropes around her wrists. His face twisted with anger, his eyes flickering with a darkness that made my skin crawl. I watched, frozen, as he pulled her roughly to her feet, his grip firm and unyielding as he led her out of the room. I stayed hidden, barely daring to breathe as they disappeared down the hallway. Moments later, I heard the front door slam shut. I crept to the window, peering out just in time to see him hastily loading her into a car, his movements frantic, his demeanor no longer composed. I knew he had realized he'd been exposed, that he was fleeing to escape whatever consequences he feared would follow. Helplessly, I watched as the car sped away, a feeling of dread settling over me. I had been so close, yet all I could do now was stand in the silence, left only with the memory of her frightened face and the knowledge that I had failed to save her. The weight of what I'd seen drove me straight to my phone. My hands shook as I dialed 911, struggling to stay calm as I described the situation to the dispatcher. The police arrived quickly, filling the street with the flash of blue and red lights, their presence a stark contrast to the quiet I'd grown used to in the neighborhood. I led them to the house, explaining every detail I could remember. The noises, the confrontation, the sight of the woman bound and terrified. They moved swiftly, searching the house with grim efficiency, their expressions growing more somber as they uncovered signs of struggle and clear evidence of the woman's captivity. The place felt hollow now, stripped of the dark presence that had lurked there only hours before. One of the officers approached me, taking my statement with a mix of sympathy and determination. I described the neighbor, his behavior, the way he'd always seemed distant, the strange comings and goings. As I spoke, the weight of guilt settled over me, a gnawing sense that I had waited too long, that my own hesitation had allowed him to escape. In the days that followed, the neighborhood fell back into its familiar quiet, but it was a silence I could no longer enjoy. Every corner of my home felt tainted, haunted by the memory of the sounds, the desperate look in her eyes, the knowledge that a nightmare had played out right next door. I couldn't shake the fear that he was still out there, roaming free, that she was still with him, trapped in a life of fear and captivity. The police kept me informed, but their updates were brief and increasingly discouraging. They were investigating, but there were no leads, no traces of him or the woman he'd taken. The air was different down there, heavy, stale, pressing down on us like it didn't want us there. Edwin, Wesley, and I had heard stories about this subway tunnel, abandoned years ago, a place forgotten by the city, hidden away and left to rot. It felt like we were stepping into a different world as we made our way down the narrow, damp path. our flashlights barely penetrating the thick darkness. Dust coated every surface, and the walls were covered in faded graffiti, a haunting reminder of a time when people moved through here daily. Now everything seemed frozen, as if the tunnel had been locked in a silent, endless night. Our footsteps echoed down the corridor, the sound bouncing off the walls, making us hyper-aware of how alone we were. We walked deeper, our voices fading into hushed whispers. It was then that I spotted them, a set of fresh footprints on the ground. They were faint but unmistakable, pressing into the layer of dust that seemed untouched everywhere else. My heart quickened. Edwin and Wesley saw them too, their faces reflecting the same mix of excitement and dread that I felt. It didn't make sense. We knew no one else should be here. And yet, the footprints were fresh, like someone had just been standing there. I glanced back the way we came, half expecting to see someone watching us, but there was nothing. Just the thick, suffocating dark stretching endlessly in both directions. The footprints led forward into the shadows, and without a word, we followed them. We followed the trail carefully, our flashlights illuminating each footprint, one after another, as we walked deeper into the tunnel. Every step we took felt heavier, and the silence around us grew, thick and oppressive. There was something wrong about it, something that made the hair on the back of my neck prickle. Edwin walked beside me, eyes darting around nervously, while Wesley kept close behind, casting quick glances over his shoulder. Then, as suddenly as they began, the footprints stopped. They just ended, right there in the middle of the path, like whoever left them had vanished into thin air. I stared at the spot, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. There was no logical reason for it. There was no place for the person to have gone. The tunnel was straight and narrow, with walls on either side. No doors, no side passages. Just a flat, empty floor where the footprints came to a sudden halt. Wesley moved his flashlight around, scanning the walls, the ceiling, the ground, searching for some clue, some explanation. But there was nothing. The silence grew even heavier, an invisible weight pressing down on us, making it hard to breathe. I could see the unease in Edwin's eyes, his jaw tight as he processed what we were seeing. For a moment, the three of us just stood there, staring at the footprints' abrupt end. Part of me wanted to turn back, to leave the tunnel and forget we ever saw them. But something kept us rooted to the spot, a twisted curiosity that pushed us forward, even as every instinct screamed at us to turn around. We moved on, more slowly this time, each step laced with an unspoken fear. The air grew colder as we continued, the darkness seeming to thicken around us. My flashlight's beam flickered, casting shifting shadows on the walls, making it hard to tell what was real and what was just a trick of the light. Edwin and Wesley were quiet now, their faces drawn, each of us feeling the tension clawing at us, gnawing away at our nerves. Then we saw it. A figure, crouched low to the ground, barely visible in the dim light. My heart hammered in my chest as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. It was human-shaped, but something about it was wrong. Its limbs were twisted, contorted, and it seemed almost unnatural, like it didn't belong here, like it didn't belong anywhere. I felt frozen, unable to move, barely able to breathe. Edwin and Wesley were equally still, their eyes wide, locked onto the figure in front of us. Slowly it began to rise, unfolding itself from the ground in jerky, disjointed movements. My flashlight's beam caught its face for just a moment, enough to see dark, hollow eyes staring back at us, empty and cold. A low murmur filled the air, barely audible at first, then growing louder, more insistent. It was coming from the figure, a stream of garbled words that made no sense, a language that sounded ancient, twisted, beyond comprehension. The sound reverberated through the tunnel, filling the space around us, pressing in on us like a physical force. The figure took a step toward us, its movements unnatural, each step jerky, as if it were being controlled by something else. I wanted to run, but my feet were rooted to the spot, my mind struggling to process the impossible scene unfolding before me. In an instant, the figure lunged, breaking the eerie stillness. The garbled muttering rose to a frantic pitch as it rushed toward us, its face twisted with an expression I couldn't decipher. Without thinking, we turned and bolted, our footsteps pounding against the tunnel floor as we fled into the darkness, our flashlights barely keeping up. My heart raced, fear surging through me as I ran. I could hear Edwin and Wesley breathing hard beside me, each of us driven by the primal need to escape, to get as far away from that thing as possible. Behind us, the figure's footsteps echoed, relentless, and its voice grew louder, the nonsensical words becoming more frantic, more aggressive. I glanced over my shoulder, catching a glimpse of it, its body contorted, limbs flailing as it ran, but somehow it was gaining on us. Panic surged, and I pushed myself harder, the air burning in my lungs, my mind racing with the horrifying thought that we might not make it out. Then, just as it seemed like we were pulling ahead, I heard the clang of metal against the wall. Something sharp and cold struck my shoulder, a sudden burst of pain as a thin line of blood appeared just beneath my collarbone. I stumbled, nearly losing my balance, the sting of the cut a harsh reminder that this figure meant to harm us. Edwin grabbed my arm, pulling me forward as we kept running, ignoring the burning pain, focused only on escaping the darkness that threatened to swallow us whole. We didn't look back again, too afraid of what we might see, too terrified of what was coming for us. We sprinted as hard as we could, but no matter how fast we ran, the figure's footsteps remained close behind, echoing down the tunnel, relentless and unnerving. I could hear Edwin gasping for air beside me, his breaths quick and shallow, a panicked rhythm that matched the pounding of my heart. Wesley kept glancing back, his flashlight bobbing wildly, casting twisted shadows that made everything seem even more surreal. Just as I thought we were putting distance between us and the figure, a metallic clang echoed through the tunnel, sharp and sudden. Before I could react, a small, rusted object, a piece of twisted metal, whizzed through the air and struck my shoulder. Pain seared through me as it grazed my skin, leaving a shallow but stinging cut. I cried out, clutching my shoulder, feeling the warm trickle of blood seeping through my fingers. The shock of the injury jolted me, the pain a brutal reminder of how real this threat was. Edwin and Wesley turned to look, their faces pale, but we had no time to stop. I gritted my teeth, swallowing the pain, and we kept running, the figure's distorted muttering growing louder behind us, its voice bouncing off the walls, filling the space around us. The fear was all-consuming, overriding everything else. We didn't care where we were going. We just wanted to put as much distance as possible between us and that thing, to escape the darkness that seemed to cling to us, pulling us back with every step. Finally, in the distance, we saw it. A faint, dim light at the end of the tunnel, barely more than a glimmer, but to us, it was salvation. We pushed ourselves harder, fueled by the desperation of escape, our legs burning as we sprinted toward that tiny beacon. The figure's footsteps began to fade behind us, the frantic muttering growing softer, as if it knew it was losing its grip on us. I dared to glance back once, just once, and saw it standing there, frozen in the middle of the tunnel, watching us with those empty, hollow eyes. It didn't chase us any further, but its gaze held a silent promise, a warning that this wasn't over. We burst out into the open air, collapsing onto the ground just beyond the tunnel entrance. I sucked in deep breaths, the fresh air filling my lungs, chasing away the suffocating stillness of the tunnel. Edwin and Wesley were beside me, both trembling, both as shaken as I was. We had escaped, but the fear hadn't left us. It lingered, pressing down like a weight, a reminder of what we had just experienced. I pulled my hand away from my shoulder, but it wasn't serious. It was superficial. The cut was just a detail. The important thing was to get out of that tunnel. I was on my usual route, mindlessly drifting through a busy public square, a sea of strangers moving around me. Everything about that day felt normal, familiar, even routine. That is, until I noticed the suitcase. It was perched almost too precisely against the bench, a dark, slightly scuffed leather case with a worn brass clasp. People moved around it like it was invisible, their footsteps echoing against the stone tiles, yet no one seemed to notice it. There was something off about it. Suitcases in crowded areas tend to attract suspicion, but this one seemed different. It wasn't just unattended, it looked like it had been left there with purpose, as if someone wanted it to be found. And that strange feeling, the unspoken sense that something was waiting for me inside, gripped me tightly. I could feel a chill travel down my spine as I hesitated, taking a final look around, almost hoping someone would claim it. But nobody came forward. Curiosity overcame caution. I approached the suitcase slowly, every step echoing in my head louder than the last. When I finally reached it, I stooped down, holding my breath as I unclasped it with trembling fingers. I hadn't even opened it fully, yet the contents were enough to make me pull back, unsettled by what I glimpsed. Inside, there were small items arranged with unsettling precision, each piece carefully placed as if part of a ritual or plan. I forced myself to lift the lid and stare into the suitcase, telling myself it was probably nothing. But it wasn't. Inside, scattered yet oddly organized, were objects that told a sinister story. A crumpled map with specific places marked in red ink, a small notebook filled with scribbled, barely legible writing, and something metallic glinting under a folded piece of cloth. I shifted the cloth carefully, revealing a small, sharp tool, like something a craftsman or, more disturbingly, a surgeon might use. The items felt like clues in a macabre scavenger hunt, each one hinting at a purpose that I couldn't fully understand. But I could sense it was meant for something dark, something that involved someone, somewhere. My mind raced with questions. Who would leave this? Why here, in such a public place? The longer I looked, the clearer it became that these weren't random objects. They were tools of preparation for something planned, something premeditated. I took a step back, then another, feeling the weight of the suitcase pressing on my mind. The rational part of me knew I should probably walk away, let someone else find it and deal with it. But the thought of leaving something this sinister, possibly dangerous, for someone else to discover made me feel responsible in some twisted way. So I closed it carefully, almost reverently, and decided I would take it to the police. They could figure out who left it and why. Carrying the suitcase was more exhausting than I anticipated, not just because of its weight, but because of the strange burden it placed on me. Every step toward the police station felt like I was sinking deeper into something I shouldn't be involved in. The people around me blurred, their faces forgotten the moment they passed. I focused only on the suitcase, on reaching my destination and handing this over to someone else. But as I walked, I couldn't shake a growing sense of dread. It started as a vague discomfort, a tingling at the back of my mind that told me I was being watched. I forced myself to ignore it, chalking it up to paranoia after what I'd seen. But soon I noticed shapes out of the corner of my eye, a figure moving at the edge of my vision, then another. When I looked back, there was nothing. Yet I couldn't escape the feeling of being followed, shadowed by something lurking just beyond sight. I tried to pick up my pace, refusing to look back anymore. I told myself it was just nerves, that carrying something this eerie had simply made me anxious. But even as I hurried, that feeling persisted, a cold, crawling sensation prickling at my neck. I kept my eyes forward, the police station looming somewhere ahead, though it felt like it was miles away. The moment I heard footsteps behind me, the panic became real. I dared a glance back, heart pounding, and saw him. A figure in dark clothes, walking at an unnerving pace, eyes locked on me in the suitcase. His expression was unreadable, but his intent was clear. He wanted what I had, and he wasn't planning to ask nicely for it. I sped up, weaving through the crowd, heart hammering in my chest as I tried to lose him. But no matter where I turned, he was always there, slipping through people, maintaining the same relentless speed. It felt like a nightmare, the kind where no matter how fast you run, the threat just keeps coming. A surge of desperation hit me, and I tried ducking into an alley, hoping to break his line of sight. I slipped into shadows, barely breathing, clutching the suitcase close. For a brief moment, silence enveloped me, and I thought maybe I'd lost him. But then his silhouette appeared at the mouth of the alley, and I knew he wouldn't stop until he had what he wanted. As I emerged back onto the main street, terror took full control. I ran, pushing past strangers, clutching the suitcase with numb fingers, desperately hoping to reach safety before he caught up. The police station felt impossibly far, every step dragging me closer to something inevitable. I couldn't think of anything but escape. But even as I ran, a small voice inside whispered that escape was impossible. The suitcase was a magnet, and I was its unwilling carrier, bound to whatever horror awaited me. My lungs burned, and my arms ached under the weight of the suitcase, but the fear kept me moving. Every time I thought I'd lost him, I'd glance back and see him there, relentless, unfazed, cutting through the crowd like he was part of its fabric. My mind raced, searching for any way out, some way to slip free of his focus. But it felt impossible, as though I were bound to this suitcase and its terrible purpose. The more I tried to lose him, the clearer it became that he was willing to chase me to the ends of the earth if it meant reclaiming it. I considered shouting for help, but the thought of drawing attention scared me just as much. Who would believe me? They'd see a person running with a suitcase, nothing more. And what if he didn't stop at simply reclaiming the suitcase? What if he decided to punish me for daring to touch what clearly belonged to him? I ducked into another narrow alley, hoping the sudden turn would throw him off. I pressed myself against the cold brick, fighting to calm my breath, listening for any sign of him. For a fleeting moment, silence fell, and I dared to think I'd managed to lose him. But then, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed down the alley, slow and steady, closing in. My heartbeat drummed in my ears as he drew nearer. I could see his shadow stretching around the corner, his figure growing larger, closer, unstoppable. Panic twisted into a sense of resignation. There was no way out. I felt trapped, as if the suitcase had somehow bound me to this stranger, its twisted contents making me complicit in whatever plan it held. With one final surge of desperation, I threw the suitcase to the ground. I backed away, hands trembling, as I watched it hit the pavement with a dull thud. The latch jostled slightly, but didn't break open. The suitcase remained shut, holding its secrets close. He slowed his pace, his gaze fixed on the suitcase, as if I had ceased to matter the moment I released it. His expression remained unreadable as he crouched down, reaching out to claim what was his. He never even looked at me. I wanted to shout, to demand answers, but the words were trapped somewhere deep inside, tangled with fear and the realization that it was better not to know. I watched in numb disbelief as he picked up the suitcase, his movements calm, almost gentle, as if he were cradling something precious. His face betrayed nothing, no relief, no anger, only an unsettling focus on the case. And then, without sparing me a single glance, he stood and turned, vanishing into the crowd as effortlessly as he'd appeared. For a long moment, I just stood there, stunned, staring at the spot where he'd disappeared. The world around me felt unreal, like a scene from someone else's life. I felt like a stranger in my own skin, left with nothing but unanswered questions and a lingering chill in my bones. The contents of that suitcase, those twisted plans and tools, I would never know what they were meant for, nor why he had pursued it with such intensity. A part of me wanted to go to the police anyway, but the futility of it kept me rooted. He was gone, and the suitcase was with him. There was no proof of what I'd seen, no way to explain the terrifying encounter in a way that wouldn't sound insane. I turned away from the alley, deciding that it was over. The job had been predictable, even comfortable. I knew the rhythm of the place, the quiet hum of the computers, the routine clatter of coffee cups, the steady tap of my coworkers' keyboards. Everyone kept to themselves for the most part, including my coworker, with whom I shared a desk cluster. We were neither friends nor strangers, just two people sharing space, exchanging polite nods and brief conversations about work. But lately, something had shifted. It started subtly. A few glances held a second too long, a silence that felt heavier than usual. I noticed him standing in doorways, his gaze flickering over me when he thought I wasn't looking. His polite smiles had faded, replaced by something unreadable, something that felt like it belonged to a stranger. At first, I brushed it off. Maybe he was going through a rough time or dealing with some personal issues. But every day, he seemed to drift further from the person I thought I knew. It was a feeling I couldn't shake, a gnawing sense that something was changing, subtly but inevitably, between us. I would catch him in my peripheral vision, lingering just a moment too long, as if he was sizing me up or assessing some unspoken plan. The strange part was, I couldn't tell if he wanted something from me or if he was just watching. Either way, the office started feeling less like a safe, familiar place and more like a setting for something I couldn't understand. A story that was slowly, unnervingly unfolding. One afternoon, he finally made his move. He approached my desk during lunch, his expression unreadable, his eyes carrying that unsettling weight they'd been holding on to. I looked up, expecting some mundane question about work, but what he said stopped me cold. "I've got something that might interest you," he said, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. "It's a group I'm part of. Something transformative." The way he said it made me feel as if I'd stepped into a conversation that had been happening without me, a script I hadn't been given. I looked at him, searching his face for a clue, for some sign that this was just a joke or a passing comment. But he continued, describing it with a strange intensity. He spoke in vague terms, mentioning the power of change and unlocking potential. The more he spoke, the more abstract it sounded, and yet I couldn't ignore the slight edge in his voice, something that felt like a quiet, dangerous invitation. When he paused, waiting for my response, I felt a tightening in my chest. Something told me not to press further, not to even consider accepting. I forced a polite smile and declined, saying I wasn't interested, trying to keep my tone casual. But his reaction left me uneasy. He simply stared at me, eyes dark and calculating, as if memorizing the moment, filing it away. His expression was as unsettling as his words had been, and as he walked away, I felt a shiver run through me, one I couldn't easily dismiss. After that, his behavior only grew stranger, darker, like some mask had slipped. He didn't speak to me directly again, but he was always nearby, lurking at the edges of my vision. He would linger around my workspace, his eyes focused on me with a look that felt almost predatory. His presence, once neutral, had turned into something menacing, something that made me feel trapped. At first, I tried to ignore it. Maybe he was just holding a grudge over my refusal, or maybe I was reading too much into his actions. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was waiting, watching for something. Every time I moved around the office, I could feel his gaze on my back, a silent, heavy weight that followed me everywhere. It was as if he was marking me somehow, making sure I understood the consequences of my refusal, even if I didn't know what they were. My workday became a series of tense moments, navigating around him, avoiding his stare, trying to act like everything was normal. But each day, his silent pursuit grew more insistent. There was a new intensity in his eyes, an anger simmering just beneath the surface. I found myself dreading every encounter, every accidental glance that seemed to draw his attention to me like a magnet. My world narrowed down to avoiding him, trying to blend into the background, yet feeling exposed every time he looked my way. The first threat arrived unexpectedly. I was leaving the office late one evening, my mind focused on getting home, when I found a note slipped under my car's windshield wiper. At first, I thought it was some kind of advertisement or a flyer, but as I unfolded it, my heart sank. The message was handwritten, the letters sharp and precise, and its words were chillingly direct. "You can't protect everyone." I stood there, staring at the note, my mind racing. There was no name, no indication of who had left it, but I knew. Deep down I felt the connection between that cryptic group, the invitation I'd turned down, and the man who had been watching me ever since. I took a shaky breath, trying to calm the growing panic, but it clung to me like a second skin. The next day, I tried to act as if nothing had happened, as if the note had just been some random prank. But when I glanced over at him, he was watching me, his mouth curled into a faint, knowing smile. The look in his eyes was unmistakable. It was a warning. I wanted to confront him, to demand an explanation, but fear held me back. Whatever he was involved in, whatever that group entailed, it was beyond anything I could understand. And his silent threat made one thing clear. If I continued to ignore him, he would take things further. For the first time, the fear spread beyond me, extending to those I cared about. I realized that my family, the people closest to me, could be at risk. The terror that had been confined to the office was seeping into my life, threatening to follow me wherever I went. After that, the tension became unbearable. Each day brought a new reminder that I was trapped, that I couldn't ignore him or the threat he posed. He would pass by my desk, close enough to whisper but loud enough for only me to hear, muttering phrases that sent chills through my spine. "People close to you are so fragile," he said once, his eyes fixed on the screen in front of him, as if he were simply making an observation. Another time, he mentioned how easy it was for accidents to happen, his voice laced with a quiet, haunting certainty. I began to notice strange things outside the office, too. Once, I came home to find my front door slightly ajar, though I was sure I'd locked it. Another day, I noticed unfamiliar footprints in the garden outside my mother's house, the soil disturbed as if someone had been watching from the shadows. The signs were subtle, barely noticeable, but each one was a message, a calculated reminder that I was under his control, that he was watching and could reach out whenever he pleased. The thought of going to the police crossed my mind, but every time I considered it, the fear of retribution silenced me. This wasn't just workplace harassment. It felt like something much darker, like I was ensnared in a game with rules I didn't understand. And with each passing day, my world grew smaller, narrowed down to survival, to finding a way out before he took things further. One afternoon, he took his intimidation a step further, this time far more openly. I was finishing up a report when he approached my desk, leaning in close, his voice a low whisper that sent a shiver through me. "Your sister has such a lovely home," he murmured, as if remarking on the weather. "It'd be a shame if anything happened there." The blood drained from my face. My sister's house was her sanctuary, the place where her kids played in the yard, where she felt safe. Hearing him bring it up, even in passing, felt like a direct attack. I wanted to scream at him, to demand he leave her alone, but all I managed was a shaky nod, my throat closing up with fear. The look in his eyes told me that he knew exactly what he was doing, and that he'd savor every moment of the fear he was instilling. In that moment, something inside me broke. I realized he had no boundaries, that he would go as far as he needed to until I was completely under his control. The terror was overwhelming, and for the first time, I felt genuinely helpless. My own safety was one thing, but the thought of him targeting my family was something I couldn't bear. I knew then that I had to find a way to escape this nightmare, even if it meant leaving behind everything I'd worked for. I barely slept that night, my mind racing as I weighed my options. The next morning, with a heavy heart and shaking hands, I made my decision. I walked into my supervisor's office and submitted my resignation, keeping my explanation vague. As I spoke, I felt a mixture of relief and despair. I was finally doing something to end this, but it also meant surrendering a part of my life to his threats. When I walked back to my desk to gather my things, he was standing nearby, watching me with a smirk that made my skin crawl. He didn't say anything, but the look on his face told me he'd won. I couldn't bring myself to look at him as I packed up my belongings, the weight of his presence pressing down on me like a shadow I couldn't escape. It felt surreal, as though I were giving up not just a job, but a part of myself, a piece of my freedom that I would never get back. Leaving the office that day felt like breaking free from a prison. It was one of those days that felt like any other. I had walked this path countless times, knew each twist, each bend, each tree that lined the way. There was a peace in the routine, in the familiar sounds of the forest, the way the light filtered through the leaves, and the soft crunch of dirt underfoot. I didn't expect anything unusual. In fact, the walk was supposed to be a way to clear my mind, to breathe in the quiet solitude. But that day, there was a shift, subtle yet undeniable. The forest felt different, quieter than usual, like something had drained the sound from the air. I couldn't place it, couldn't understand why my steps felt heavier or why each rustle seemed sharper, more pronounced. I tried to brush it off as a trick of the mind. After all, it was just a walk. Yet a faint feeling of unease settled over me as I continued down the trail, my eyes scanning the landscape with a sense of purpose I couldn't quite explain. Then, near the base of an old, gnarled tree, I noticed something odd. A patch of dirt had been disturbed, leaves scattered in a way that looked unnatural, almost as if someone had tried to cover something. I paused, curiosity tugging at me, urging me to look closer. Kneeling down, I brushed away the leaves and soil, my fingers sinking into the earth until something metallic and cold met my touch. A narrow, rusted metal door was embedded in the ground, barely visible beneath the layers of dirt and leaves. My heart beat faster, a mix of excitement and trepidation. I knew, instinctively, that this was no ordinary find. Something hidden, something deliberately concealed, lay beneath that door. Despite the slight fear prickling at the back of my mind, curiosity won out. I pushed against the door, its rusty hinges creaking as I lifted it open. A chill wafted up from the darkness below, stale and musty, the scent of damp earth and age. There, leading down into the unknown, was a narrow metal ladder, disappearing into the shadows below. I hesitated, gripping the cold edge of the opening, a part of me screaming to turn back, to leave whatever this was undiscovered. But the pull was too strong. The thrill of the unknown, the chance to uncover something hidden, propelled me forward. I began to descend, each rung cold and slightly slick beneath my hands. The silence in the bunker was almost oppressive, a heavy quiet that seemed to press down on me the further I went. The only light came from a single, dim bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting weak, flickering shadows across the cramped space below. As my feet hit the concrete floor, I took in the strange surroundings, a small, confined room with walls lined with shelves. There was an eerie sense of abandonment, yet everything looked strangely recent, as if the person who'd been here had left only moments ago. The shelves held a scattered collection of belongings, torn clothes, empty food cans, a cracked mirror leaning against one wall. The place felt more than deserted. It felt like a hideout, a last refuge from something unknown, a place to vanish from the world. I moved deeper into the bunker, my eyes adjusting to the dim light as I examined each item, each strange remnant left behind. It was hard to shake the feeling that someone had lived here in desperation, hiding, surviving off scraps, as if they'd been on the run. But from what? Or from whom? My gaze landed on a stack of worn, water-stained notebooks piled on one of the shelves. The pages were filled with frantic, scrawled messages, phrases repeated again and again in a shaky hand. It's getting closer. They can't see me here. I'm running out of time. Each line seemed more desperate than the last, as though whoever had written them was spiraling deeper into fear. I flipped through the pages, heart pounding, as a clear story began to emerge. Someone had been hiding, living in terror, documenting their descent into an unknown dread. The handwriting grew more erratic with each page, looping and jagged, the words blurring together in a chaotic script. Each phrase seemed to pulse with fear, and as I read, I could almost feel the panic radiating off the pages, as if the writer's terror had seeped into the ink. I set the notebooks down, my hands trembling, the quiet pressing down on me, filling the space with an oppressive weight. I turned my attention to a small table against the far wall. On it lay a series of old, yellowed maps, each one marked with red ink, routes snaking out from the bunker in all directions, branching paths and crossed-out lines as if tracing failed attempts at escape. Arrows pointed to different locations, some marked with dates, others with desperate annotations: safe, avoid, too close. Each mark told a story of fear and flight, a struggle to stay one step ahead of whatever hunted them. The reality of the situation settled over me. Whoever had stayed here hadn't simply been hiding, they'd been planning, calculating their escape with meticulous precision, mapping out a path to freedom. But from what? Or more chillingly, from whom? As I studied the maps, a sound caught my attention, a faint whispering, so quiet that at first I thought it was my imagination. But as I listened, the sound grew louder, a hushed murmur filling the silence, seeping into every corner of the bunker. It was low, almost a chant, repeating something indecipherable, but close enough to feel as though it were breathing against my skin. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I turned toward the sound, unable to see its source, my heart pounding in my chest. It was then that I knew I needed to leave. I backed away, my eyes never leaving the darkened corner where the whispers seemed to come from. Panic overtook me, my feet carrying me swiftly to the ladder as the whispers grew louder, a chorus of words I couldn't understand, but felt in every nerve. Clinging to the cold metal of the ladder, I forced myself to pause, to listen. The whispers echoed from every corner of the bunker, filling the air with a sound that was both faint and somehow overwhelming, like voices overlapping, speaking in tones just below clarity. I couldn't make out individual words, but the rhythm of their speech sent chills through me, a relentless murmur that seemed to draw closer, pressing against me from all sides. A sickening sense of dread took hold, a feeling that the walls were closing in. It was as if I were no longer alone in that dimly lit room, as if the voices had substance, forming a presence that surrounded me, unseen but very real. I wanted to bolt up the ladder, but something held me there, a twisted mix of fear and morbid curiosity keeping me rooted to the spot. The longer I listened, the more certain I became that the voices weren't just in my mind. They were coming from the bunker itself, like an echo from its dark, forgotten history. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, becoming a jumbled cacophony of noise. The air felt thick, oppressive, and each breath became harder to take. My heart pounded, my skin prickling as the voices seemed to close in, surrounding me, binding me to the spot. Whatever was down here, whatever had left those desperate messages, felt close, as if it were standing just beyond sight, watching. With a surge of fear, I broke free from the trance, my instinct for survival kicking in. I turned, gripping the ladder as I scrambled up, each rung feeling impossibly heavy beneath my hands. The whispers echoed around me, filling the small space with an intensity that grew louder with every step. I didn't dare look back, too afraid of what I might see or imagine lurking in the darkness below. I pulled myself up faster, my heart hammering in my chest, the air around me seeming to thicken as if trying to hold me back. My hands shook as I climbed, every nerve in my body screaming to escape. I could still hear the whispers, their tone shifting, growing almost desperate, as though they were pleading with me to stay, to understand. But the fear drowned out everything else. I just needed to get out, to escape that place before whatever haunted it claimed me too. As I neared the top, I felt a wave of relief. The fresh air, cold and crisp, wafted down from above, and I pushed harder, finally reaching the surface. I stumbled out of the bunker, collapsing onto the forest floor, breathing in the night air as if it were my first breath in hours. I slammed the metal door shut behind me, sealing in the darkness and whatever lay within it. The whispers faded, swallowed by the silence of the woods, but the terror remained, clinging to me like a shadow. The weekend away had been a chance to unwind, a brief escape from the everyday grind. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I was eager for the familiar quiet of my own home. But the moment I stepped inside, I felt something shift, a subtle, unnerving change in the air. The space seemed colder, the silence heavier, almost as if the house had been holding its breath in my absence. At first, I thought I was imagining things. After all, a few days away was hardly enough time for a place to feel unfamiliar. But as I moved through the rooms, little details began to stand out. The chair by the window was angled differently, pulled slightly back from its usual place. A window in the kitchen, one I was sure I'd closed, was now cracked open, letting in a faint chill. On the counter, a smudge marked the spot where I usually set my keys, a dark streak that hadn't been there when I left. I brushed off the feeling, forcing myself to believe it was just nerves. After all, houses creak and settle, and maybe I'd forgotten a few things in my hurry to leave. But even as I tried to dismiss it, the unease settled deeper, a faint whisper in the back of my mind that something was wrong. I walked through each room, checking for anything else out of place, my footsteps echoing in the quiet. I told myself it was nothing, yet the strange tension lingered, threading through the air like an invisible presence. I tried to ignore the feeling, to chalk it up to an overactive imagination. A weekend away can make anyone feel out of sync with their own home, right? I pushed aside the unease, convincing myself it was just the natural strangeness of returning after time away. But as the days went on, the unsettling feeling didn't fade. Instead, it seemed to deepen, casting a quiet shadow over my routines. Each time I came back to the house, something small and almost unnoticeable would catch my eye. It was nothing I could put my finger on, nothing that would hold up under any logical scrutiny. A stack of books, slightly misaligned on the shelf. A mug left on the counter that I couldn't remember using. The air, carrying a faint scent I couldn't quite identify. Something smoky, stale, lingering as if it had seeped into the walls. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that these were simply details I was overlooking, tiny changes I'd somehow missed in the normal ebb and flow of life. But with each passing day, the feeling grew stronger, a quiet, insistent whisper that told me something was off. The house, my refuge, felt increasingly foreign, almost hostile, as though it were slowly changing under the influence of an unseen hand. Eventually, I couldn't ignore it any longer. Each time I returned, there was something new, a fresh reminder that I wasn't alone in my own home. The smell of smoke, faint but undeniable, would linger in the air. And though I tried to rationalize it, each new sign left me on edge, my skin prickling with an anxiety I couldn't shake. It was as though someone was studying me, learning my routines, shifting objects just enough to make me notice. I started to grow paranoid, checking my surroundings constantly, straining to see if something else was out of place. I'd look at the bookshelves, counting the spines as if memorizing their order, hoping I could spot any changes before they became obvious. But the subtlety of it all was maddening. Whoever was doing this knew exactly how to stay under the radar, leaving only the faintest of hints, just enough to unsettle me, but never enough to prove anything concrete. The house no longer felt safe. I would sit in the living room, listening for sounds, half expecting to catch footsteps or the creak of a door. But there was only silence, a silence that seemed to mock me, to amplify the faint scent of smoke and the knowledge that something wasn't right. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that whoever was leaving these signs knew exactly how to get under my skin. With my unease turning into outright fear, I decided to take action. I couldn't keep living with the gnawing suspicion that my home had been invaded. So, I changed the locks, adding extra bolts and reinforcing the doors, doing everything I could to make myself feel secure again. Each time I left, I checked every room, making a mental inventory of everything, determined to remember each small detail. I wanted to catch whoever was doing this, to find proof that it wasn't all in my head. But even with the heightened security, the signs persisted. I would come home to find a drawer slightly open, or a light that I swore I'd turned off now, casting its dim glow over an empty room. The changes were always small, subtle, but unmistakable. My new locks and bolts hadn't made any difference. Whoever was entering my home, they were skilled, capable of slipping in and out, as though the barriers meant nothing. The constant vigilance was wearing me down, each day feeling heavier than the last. The safety measures had been my last line of defense, a way to convince myself that I could regain control. But as I stood in my own home, feeling like a stranger, I knew that I was losing this silent, invisible battle. The person behind this, whoever they were, was one step ahead, leaving me to question every sound, every shift in the air, as though the walls themselves held their secrets. The final proof came one night as I returned home, exhausted from work and eager to forget my fears, even if only for a few hours. But as soon as I opened the door, something immediately felt wrong. The air was damp, carrying a faint earthy smell that hadn't been there before. My heart skipped as I noticed, just inside the entrance, a set of muddy footprints. They weren't mine. I stared at them, rooted in place, my mind racing to explain what I was seeing. The prints were fresh, still wet, leading from the front door into the living room before abruptly disappearing, as if the person had vanished into thin air. Every rational thought dissolved, leaving only the sharp edge of fear. Someone had been here, and worse, they'd left their mark deliberately, as if to let me know they'd been watching, moving freely through my home. I checked every corner of the house, my breath shallow, hands shaking as I tried to find any sign that they were still there. But the rooms were empty, silent, the footprints the only trace of their presence. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had left them hadn't gone far, that they might still be watching, hidden just beyond the walls. After that night, I knew I couldn't stay. The footprints had been a warning, a message that any sense of control I had was an illusion. I could change locks, add alarms, but none of it would matter. Whoever had invaded my life could bypass any barrier, slipping in and out as they pleased, leaving subtle reminders of their power over me. The decision came with a strange mix of relief and dread. Leaving felt like the only option, the only way to regain some semblance of safety. I began to pack, throwing essentials into bags, trying to ignore the tightness in my chest, the feeling that I was being driven out of my own home. I told no one about my plans, too afraid that somehow my movements were being watched even beyond the house. In silence, I gathered my things, determined to disappear without a trace. That night, as I stood by the door with my packed bags, I took one last look around the house. It felt hollow, as though it had already shed me, no longer mine. I locked the door behind me and walked away without looking back. The old house had a weight to it, the kind of age that hung in the air, thick and heavy, settling into the corners and creaking through the floorboards. When I first stepped inside, it felt like I was stepping into another era, dusty, dimly lit, and filled with the faint smell of mold. The job was supposed to be straightforward, regular cleaning in exchange for a generous pay, a simple enough arrangement. The employer, a stiff, cold man, wasted no time in detailing the routine, listing each task with a precision that left no room for questions. And then, as we moved from room to room, he stopped in front of a particular door, a plain, narrow wooden door at the end of the hallway. His expression turned colder, his tone sharp. "This door," he said, pointing, "is not to be opened, ever." I nodded, feeling a chill creep up my spine. There was something in his voice, an edge that made me tense. He waited a moment, watching me, as if gauging my reaction, before turning away. As he left, his words echoed in my mind. Why single out one door? The warning lingered, unsettling in its intensity. But I shook it off, reasoning that the rule, strange as it was, wasn't my concern. I was here to clean, nothing more. The first day passed without incident. I dusted shelves, scrubbed floors, and polished wood surfaces until the faint sheen of age shone through. I tried to ignore the strange door at the end of the hall, focusing on the tasks at hand. But as I worked, I began to notice small things, a faint, odd smell wafting through the air when I moved past that door, something damp and stale, sour and metallic. At first, I dismissed it as part of the house's general decay. But as the days passed, the smell became harder to ignore. It seemed to intensify each time I cleaned, lingering near the door, prickling my senses with a sour, acrid edge. And then there were the sounds, a faint shuffling, a soft, irregular scratching that sent chills down my spine. The noises were too quiet to be certain, almost as if they were imagined, yet they grew more distinct each time I listened. I tried to put it out of my mind, convincing myself it was just the house settling, the usual creaks and groans of an old structure. But each time I passed that door, a growing curiosity tugged at me, filling my mind with questions. What could be hidden there? What was it that I wasn't supposed to see? The days passed, and the door's mystery grew heavier, pulling me in with a strange, unsettling allure. Each time I walked by it, my eyes would linger a bit longer, my mind filling with thoughts I couldn't shake. What was the harm in knowing? What could possibly be so terrible that I wasn't allowed to see? The rule that once felt reasonable now felt oppressive, even suspicious. One afternoon, as I dusted a high shelf, I found a key, tucked behind an old, forgotten box. It was unremarkable, worn and dull, but something about it felt familiar, like it belonged to something nearby. A quiet thrill ran through me as I held it, wondering if it might be the key to the forbidden door. I glanced around, half expecting to see the employer's cold eyes watching me, but I was alone. Pocketing the key, I finished my work, my pulse quickening with each step, as I imagined what I might find. The key felt heavy in my pocket, as though urging me toward the door, daring me to unlock it and uncover its secrets. By the time I finished cleaning, curiosity had transformed into a quiet resolve. I knew I wouldn't be able to leave without seeing for myself what lay behind that door. When the house finally grew silent, I made my way to the end of the hall, heart pounding as I stood before the forbidden door. I took a breath, hesitating for a moment, my mind racing through the warnings, the employer's stern expression flashing through my memory. But curiosity overpowered caution, and with a trembling hand I slipped the key into the lock. The click echoed in the quiet hallway, loud and final, as though the door itself were welcoming me in. I pushed it open, my breath catching as the dim light revealed the room beyond. The air was thick, stale, the smell stronger than ever, wrapping around me like a shroud. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, taking in the narrow space, the stacks of bags lining the walls, and the dark liquid pooling beneath them. I took a step inside, the floor sticky beneath my shoes. The bags, dozens of them, were large, misshapen, and tied tightly, each one oozing the same dark, viscous liquid that smeared the floor in thick, oily trails. A sickening realization gripped me as I backed away, my hand trembling as I reached for the door. But before I could close it, a sound, footsteps, steady and unmistakable, echoed from the hallway. The employer had returned. I froze, caught between the door and the darkness behind me. The footsteps grew louder, slow and deliberate, echoing down the hallway with an ominous finality. I wanted to close the door, to erase any trace of my curiosity, but I was too late. My heart raced as the door creaked wider, revealing the room in all its macabre detail. The bags, now unavoidable, lay stacked against the walls, some torn or worn thin, leaking that thick, dark liquid that pooled at my feet. The smell was overwhelming now, a mix of rot, metal, and something unidentifiable, something that clung to the back of my throat, filling me with a nausea I couldn't shake. I tried to avert my eyes, but my gaze kept slipping back to the bags, the shadows clinging to their surfaces, as if something inside were shifting, moving. I realized then that whatever was in those bags wasn't just garbage or debris. Something was hidden here, something that shouldn't be seen. I took a shaky step backward, a wave of horror washing over me. I didn't need to open the bags to understand the weight of what I'd found. Every instinct screamed to run, to leave this place and forget what I'd seen. But before I could move, a shadow fell across the doorway. I looked up to find the employer standing there, his face contorted with a rage I hadn't seen before. His eyes, usually cold and distant, were now blazing with anger, a dark intensity that made my blood run cold. He didn't say anything at first, just stared, his gaze shifting from me to the open room and the bags lined up in silent, grotesque rows. Did I not make myself clear? His voice was low, each word laced with a barely contained fury. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out, my throat closing up with fear. His expression twisted further as he took a step closer, blocking the exit, trapping me between him and the horrors in the room. I told you not to open this door, he continued, his tone darkening. And yet here you are, sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. I stammered, trying to explain, to apologize, but he silenced me with a look, one that promised consequences I didn't want to imagine. Leave, he finally said, his voice cold and final. Take your things and go, and don't ever come back. The command was clear, leaving no room for argument. I nodded, scrambling past him, the weight of his gaze burning into my back as I fled down the hallway. I grabbed my belongings, my hands shaking as I stuffed them into my bag, the house now a maze of shadows and fear. I could feel his presence lingering in every corner, the silent threat hanging over me like a storm cloud. My mind raced, each step bringing a fresh wave of panic as I replayed the scene in my head, the smell, the bags, the dark liquid. The door loomed in my thoughts, an image I couldn't shake, a reminder of what I'd uncovered and the danger I had narrowly escaped. As I hurried out, I stole one last glance down the hallway, half expecting to see him standing there watching, waiting. But the corridor was empty, the shadows swallowing everything, leaving only a lingering dread that seemed to seep into my bones. The house, once merely strange, now felt like a prison, a place holding secrets that I was grateful to leave behind.